The unexpected encounter. Willow Creek Mall on a warm Saturday afternoon was teeming with life. People moved through the hallways, chatting, laughing, and going about their usual business. The smell of freshly brewed coffee from the local cafe wafted through the air, mixing with the familiar hum of the mall's ambient music. To most of the shoppers, the day was ordinary. A quick trip to the stores, a chance to pick up a few things, a moment of relaxation in the midst of busy lives. But for one woman, this trip would be anything but typical. Claire Wilson, a 68-year-old grandmother, was just finishing up her outing. Her mission had been simple: buy a gift for her grandson, Marcus, who was turning 12 next week. Claire adored her only grandchild, and as she walked out of the toy store, her hands clutching the brightly wrapped present, a smile tugged at the corners of her lips. Marcus had been asking for this particular action figure for months, and she had finally found it on sale. She was excited to give it to him. It was the little moments like these, the simple acts of kindness and love, that filled her heart with warmth. Despite her age, Claire had never let anything slow her down. Sure, her joints ached a little more these days, and she couldn't walk as quickly as she used to, but she was determined to live independently. She hadn't always had the easiest life. Raised in a time when racial tensions were high and opportunities were scarce, Claire had faced countless obstacles, but she had always found a way to rise above them. Her resilience was something she passed on to her children and grandchildren. She was proud of the family she had raised, and her heart swelled with pride whenever she thought of her son, Marcus. As a captain in the police force, he had worked tirelessly to make sure justice was served in the community, and she knew he had become a man of great integrity. That afternoon, however, Claire had no idea that her peaceful day was about to take a drastic turn. As she made her way to the parking lot, the sun warming her face and the gentle breeze rustling through her hair, Claire felt a strange unease. It wasn't the kind of unease one feels when they're in danger, but more like a nagging sensation at the back of her mind. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she had learned over the years to trust her instincts. She glanced over her shoulder, scanning the parking lot, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Claire continued walking, her shoes tapping against the pavement. The small, crinkling noise of the shopping bag in her hand was the only sound that accompanied her as she moved toward her car. She was parked near the edge of the lot, away from the crowded spaces closest to the entrance. The last few steps were almost within her reach when, out of nowhere, she was approached by two men in uniform. At first, Claire thought they might be mall security or perhaps a couple of helpful strangers, offering assistance with her bags. She had no reason to think otherwise. But as the two officers got closer, the tension in the air thickened, and something felt wrong. The taller officer, with a grim expression on his face, stepped forward. "Hey, what do you think you're doing here?" Officer Matthews demanded, his voice cutting through the calm afternoon air. There was a harshness to his tone, a thin layer of hostility that caught Claire off guard. Startled, Claire stopped in her tracks, her heart rate quickening. She hadn't been doing anything out of the ordinary. She wasn't loitering. She wasn't causing trouble. She was simply walking to her car after a peaceful shopping trip. Still clutching the bag, she blinked in confusion. "I'm just going to my car," Claire said softly, trying to assess the situation. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, not from fear, but from the sudden unease that bubbled up within her. She wondered if maybe something had happened that she didn't know about. Were they looking for someone else? But the officer didn't relent. His eyes narrowed as he looked her over, his gaze scrutinizing and sharp. "What do you have in that bag?" he asked, his voice now laced with suspicion. His partner, Officer Davis, had moved closer by this point, his posture stiff and his gaze cold. Claire's stomach twisted. Was she being accused of something? She felt her throat tighten, the pressure building in her chest. She glanced at the shopping bag in her hands, which seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. It wasn't large, just a small gift for her grandson, but it suddenly felt like it was a potential weapon in their eyes. "There's just a gift for my grandson in here," Claire said quickly, her voice quivering with both confusion and disbelief. "It's nothing dangerous. Just a toy." But her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. Officer Davis, with a disbelieving smirk, stepped forward and grabbed the bag from her hand without warning. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she tried to hold onto it, but Davis was already pulling it away from her grasp. She stepped back, her frailty becoming apparent as her legs wobbled under the sudden tension. "No," Claire gasped. "Please, I haven't done anything wrong." She watched in horror as the contents of the bag spilled onto the pavement. The bright toy that had been so carefully chosen for her grandson now lay in the dirt. Claire's heart sank. She was just trying to do something nice, and now her simple act of love had been turned into a confrontation. But the officers weren't done yet. Officer Matthews reached for Claire's arm, grabbing it roughly. Claire winced from the pain, the years of wear and tear on her body reacting harshly to the force he applied. The old woman tried to pull away, but Matthew's grip tightened, sending a jolt of pain through her body. "Please, you're hurting me," Claire whispered, her voice shaking now, her knees buckling slightly under the strain. But Matthews showed no sign of letting go. The officers were too focused on their own authority to listen to her. In their eyes, she was just another person who didn't belong, another target to be dealt with. Claire felt the blood rush to her face as the humiliation of the situation set in. Her frail body was no match for the force these officers were exerting on her. She could hear the murmur of the crowd gathering around them, some stopping to look, others filming the whole incident with their phones. But none of them intervened. Some of them turned their heads, avoiding the scene, as if it were just another case of routine police work. She wanted to scream out for help, but her voice seemed to get stuck in her throat. The tight grip on her arm made it hard to breathe, and tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. This wasn't how she had envisioned her afternoon. She hadn't done anything wrong. She had only come to the mall to buy a gift for her grandson, and now she was being treated like a criminal. As Matthews prepared to forcefully cuff Claire, something unexpected happened. A voice, strong, commanding, and filled with authority, cut through the tension. "What do you think you're doing?" Both officers froze. Claire's head snapped up, her heart racing as the sound of footsteps drew nearer. The crowd went silent, their eyes shifting toward the newcomer. Claire couldn't see his face yet, but she could feel the change in the air. It was as though the world itself had stopped moving. The man approached quickly, his steps purposeful and steady. He was tall, confident, and his gaze never left the officers. As he closed the distance, he spoke again, this time with a tone that demanded respect. "What do you think you're doing with my mother?" he asked, his voice unwavering. Claire's heart skipped a beat. The words took a moment to sink in, but when they did, everything else seemed to disappear. It was as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. She knew that voice. She knew that presence, and the realization hit her like a wave. Standing before her was none other than Marcus Wilson, her son, Captain Marcus Wilson of the police force, a man whose every step was rooted in integrity and a deep sense of justice. He had always stood for what was right, but now he was standing up for her. Claire's chest tightened, the sudden wave of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. The officers, still reeling from the man's question, turned slowly, their faces paling as they took in Marcus's presence. The weight of his badge, the authority it carried, was enough to make both Matthews and Davis hesitate. The situation, which had begun as a moment of terror and confusion for Claire, was about to take a drastic turn. And little did the officers know, they were about to face the consequences of their actions. The confrontation and the truth unfolds. The two police officers stood motionless, as if time itself had frozen around them. Claire's heart, still pounding from the shock, fluttered slightly as she turned her head to see her son approaching. The voice that had cut through the chaos was unmistakable. It was Marcus. Her pride surged, mixed with relief, as she recognized the familiar, commanding presence of her son. Marcus Wilson had always been a man of distinction, His reputation as a dedicated, honest police captain solidified over the years. But now, standing in front of his own officers, his stance was different. It was not just one of authority, but one of fierce protectiveness. And as Claire's eyes locked with his, something within her broke open. She felt an overwhelming rush of emotions, the kind that only a mother who had seen the good in her child could understand. Her son was here, and he was about to take the situation into his own hands. "Excuse me, officers," Marcus said, his voice low, deliberate, and laced with a subtle power that seemed to draw all attention to him. "I ask you a question. What do you think you're doing with my mother?" His words hung in the air, a stark contrast to the tense silence that had preceded them. Claire watched as the two officers, caught off guard, looked from each other to her son, their expressions flickering between confusion, surprise, and unease. Officer Matthews, who had been the one to accost Claire, straightened his posture and took a step back, his eyes briefly darting to his partner for reassurance. But there was no reassurance to be found. Not now. Not with Marcus standing before them. "We're handling a situation here," Matthews stammered, trying to regain some semblance of control over the situation. But his voice lacked the usual authority that came with the badge. "Move along. Nothing to see here." But Marcus didn't budge. He took a step forward, closing the distance between himself and the officers. His gaze didn't waver as he locked eyes with Matthews, his expression cold and unreadable, his body language exuding an unspoken command that no one could ignore. "I ask you a question," Marcus repeated, this time more forcefully. "What do you think you're doing with my mother?" The words hit like a thunderclap, reverberating through the silence. The officers were frozen, their eyes wide as they began to process what was happening. The full weight of their mistake came crashing down on them. But it wasn't until Marcus took out his badge and held it up that they fully understood the gravity of their situation. "I'm Captain Marcus Wilson," he continued, his voice still unwavering. "Internal affairs. And this woman," he nodded toward Claire, who was now standing beside him, "is my mother." Claire's heart skipped a beat as she heard those words. She had always known that Marcus would rise to greatness, but hearing him speak with such resolve, with such certainty, made her chest swell with pride. This was no longer about an elderly woman being wrongfully detained by overzealous officers. This was about something deeper, about a son standing up for his mother, about righting a wrong that went far beyond just one individual. The officers stood stunned, their faces draining of color as the truth sank in. Officer Davis, who had been silent up until this point, suddenly shifted on his feet, his nervous eyes flicking between Claire and Marcus. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His expression shifted from uncertainty to anxiety. He had been complicit in this moment of injustice, and now, the weight of their mistake bore down on him. We didn't know, sir," Davis finally managed to mutter, his voice shaking. We thought she was someone else." The clumsy excuse did nothing to alleviate the situation. Claire's jaw clenched as she tried to steady her emotions. She had lived through a lifetime of subtle racism, the kind that whispered in the shadows of everyday encounters. But this was something more blatant, something more violent. It stung deep in her heart. She had spent years teaching her children to stand tall, to fight for what was right. But now, as her son stood before these two officers, she realized how much she had underestimated the power of his voice. Marcus, however, was done with their excuses. He was done with their apologies that meant nothing. "You thought she was what?" Marcus's voice cut through the air like a blade. His tone had shifted from controlled authority to raw fury. "A criminal, a threat to the peace, just because she's an elderly black woman in a mall. That's what you saw when you looked at my mother. A criminal." The question hung heavy in the air, unanswered. Matthews, clearly rattled by Marcus's words, fumbled for an explanation, but nothing he said could undo the damage they had already caused. The crowd that had gathered around them, silent observers only moments before, were now murmuring amongst themselves, phones raised, capturing every moment of the unfolding scene. Some of them seemed to have recognized Marcus, and whispers began to spread through the crowd, their eyes widening as they understood who he was. Marcus didn't give the officers a chance to answer. His voice rose in volume and intensity, each word striking with purpose. You assumed the worst of her because she doesn't fit the profile of who you think should be shopping in this mall. Did you ever stop to think about who she is, or did you just see her as another problem to deal with? Claire, still standing by her son's side, felt a surge of emotion swell within her. She wasn't just his mother. She wasn't just some woman being unfairly treated by the system. She was a person who had lived through years of struggle, of watching her community suffer. And now, at the age of 68, she was once again being treated like she didn't belong. But now, Marcus was here. He was standing beside her, fighting for her. And that meant everything. The officers, unable to offer any justifications for their actions, stood awkwardly. Matthews, who had been so quick to assert his authority just moments earlier, seemed to shrink in front of Marcus. The arrogance he had exhibited was gone, replaced by a palpable sense of fear. Davis, on the other hand, had gone silent, his head bowed, no longer meeting anyone's gaze. "You think this is over?" Marcus continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think you can treat my mother like this and walk away without consequences? Think again." The crowd, now fully engaged, began to react. People murmured louder, some expressing their disgust with the officers' behavior, others calling out their names, urging them to face the consequences of their actions. Marcus, unfazed by the growing tension around him, turned to Claire, gently placing his hand on her shoulder. "I've got this, Mom," he said softly, his voice steady. "You're okay now." Claire nodded, her heart filled with both gratitude and sorrow. She was relieved to have Marcus there, but she was still shaken. The humiliation of what had just happened, the rough treatment, the assumption that she was a criminal simply because of her age and race, was hard to shake off. But she knew that this moment wasn't just about what had happened to her. It was about something much bigger. Turning back to the officers, Marcus's voice hardened again. "Do you have any evidence that my mother has committed a crime? Did you witness her do anything illegal? Or did you simply decide she didn't belong here? Did you ever stop to ask yourself what the hell you were doing before it escalated this far?" The silence from the officers was deafening. Davis opened his mouth again, but no words came out. There was nothing they could say that would erase the truth of their actions. "This is going on record," Marcus stated, his tone final, unwavering. "I'm filing a full report on both of you. You will be held accountable for your actions today. Your careers are over." The officers stood frozen, the weight of their mistake pressing down on them with every passing second. The crowd that had gathered was now buzzing with excitement, phones raised, capturing the confrontation in real time. The video would spread quickly. People would see what had happened, and they would demand justice. For Claire, the tears that had threatened to fall earlier were now gone. She wasn't just a victim. She wasn't just an old woman who had been wronged. She was part of something bigger now. And her son, Marcus, had ensured that the world would see the truth. As they walked away toward their car, the tension in the air seemed to dissipate. Claire, still a little shaken but comforted by Marcus's presence, felt a mix of emotions she couldn't quite articulate. She had been mistreated, humiliated in front of a crowd, but now she was finally seeing justice take shape. Her son had stood up for her. He had stood up for all the people who had been mistreated and wronged. And this moment, this confrontation, was the beginning of something far greater than either of them could have imagined. The unraveling truth and the unspoken battle. The tension in the air hung heavy as Marcus guided Claire away from the officers, leading her toward their car. Every step they took seemed to echo with the weight of what had just transpired. As they walked, the crowd that had gathered slowly began to disperse, though many lingered behind, still recording, still whispering among themselves. Their phones, like modern-day cameras of justice, had captured every moment. Every injustice, every word spoken in anger, every false assumption that had been thrust upon Claire. But as Marcus walked, his head held high, his mind was already racing. This wasn't over. It wasn't just about what had happened to his mother. It was about something far deeper. This was a moment that would reverberate beyond Willow Creek Mall, beyond the two officers who had treated Claire with such disdain. It was about systemic racism, about the unchecked abuse of power that had become all too familiar in the communities they served. For Marcus, this was no longer just a confrontation. This was a reckoning. The moment they reached their car, Marcus opened the door for Claire, helping her into the passenger seat. His hands lingered for a moment on her frail shoulders, offering comfort, but there was a fire in his eyes, something that couldn't be extinguished. Claire, still in shock, sat down in the seat, her body trembling from the brutal treatment she had just endured. Her mind was racing, but the physical and emotional toll of what had happened was overwhelming. She had been humiliated in front of a crowd, shoved to the ground by officers who were supposed to protect her. And yet, in that moment, as her son stood before her, she felt something stirring deep within her. It wasn't just the anger she had lived with for decades. It was something else, something that had been ignited by Marcus's unwavering defense of her. Claire took a deep breath, steadying herself as she buckled her seatbelt. She looked out the window, her eyes unfocused, trying to process everything that had just happened. The weight of the situation was still sinking in. "Marcus, why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible as the car engine roared to life. "Why did they treat me like that?" Marcus glanced over at her, his jaw tight, the muscles in his face clenched as he kept his focus on the road ahead. His knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel, but he didn't flinch. He had seen this kind of injustice before, had witnessed firsthand the way certain people in positions of power use their authority to demean and belittle others. But to see it happen to his own mother, it was something he had never imagined. "Because they think they can," Marcus said, his voice rough, filled with frustration. "Because in their eyes, people like you don't belong. They see an older black woman in a mall, and they think they can just target her. They think they can treat her like she's invisible, like she's not worth respecting. They think they can get away with it because that's the way it's always been." Claire's heart ached at his words, the truth of it cutting deeper than any physical pain. She had lived through the cruel realities of being black in a world that often saw her as less than. The daily microaggressions, the stares, the judgment, it had all been a part of her life for so long. But this was something different. This wasn't just a glance from a stranger in the street or a rude comment from a store clerk. This was the force of the law, the very people who were supposed to protect and serve, abusing their power in the most public way imaginable. For a moment, Claire was silent, the weight of the realization pressing on her chest. She wasn't just a victim of circumstance. She was part of a much larger narrative. A narrative of history that had told people like her that they weren't welcome, that they didn't matter. And yet, as she sat there in her son's car, she realized something. Marcus was different. He wasn't going to let it slide. He wasn't going to let the system keep treating people like her as disposable. "Marcus," Claire said softly, her voice breaking with emotion. "I didn't deserve that. I was just trying to get a gift for my grandson. I don't even understand. Why me?" "I know, Mom," Marcus replied, his voice filled with compassion. "You didn't deserve any of it. But that's exactly why this matters. They chose you because they thought you wouldn't fight back. They thought you were just another person who would stay silent, who would accept their mistreatment. But we're not going to let that happen. We can't." Claire turned to face her son, the tears that had been threatening to fall now slipping down her cheeks. The anger, the hurt, the confusion. It all seemed to come rushing to the surface. But beneath it all, there was something stronger. The pride of knowing her son, a man of integrity, had just stood up for her in a way she would never forget. For Marcus, there was a fire that burned deep within him. The years of seeing his mother suffer, of watching his own community endure these same injustices, had built up to this moment. He had become a captain in the police force, not just to serve, but to change it from the inside. He had always known that the system was flawed, that corruption ran deep in certain places, and that those who had sworn to protect and serve didn't always live up to their oaths. But now, standing up to those very officers, his own colleagues, was a decision that he knew would have far-reaching consequences. As the car sped down the road, Marcus's thoughts were already turning toward the next step. What had happened at the mall wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern. He had seen it too many times before. The racial profiling, the abuse of power, the way certain people were treated as less than. He couldn't let it slide. Not when it involved his mother. Not when it involved anyone else. "We're going to make sure this doesn't go unnoticed," Marcus said, his voice resolute. "I'm filing a full report on both of them. Matthews and Davis. This is not the first time they've stepped out of line. It won't be the last if we don't do something." Claire nodded, though a knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. She had seen how these things often went, how the stories of victims like her were often swept under the rug, how the people in power turned a blind eye when one of their own was caught in wrongdoing. But this time, it felt different. This time, her son wasn't just a part of the system. He was going to take it down from the inside. As they drove toward home, the silence between them was filled with an unspoken understanding. They both knew what was at stake. They both understood the risks. But they also understood the importance of standing up for what was right. In the days that followed, Marcus worked tirelessly to file the necessary reports, gather evidence, and push for disciplinary action against the two officers. It wasn't easy. There were those within the department who tried to silence him, who tried to bury the story. But Marcus refused to back down. He had his mother's strength, and his own unshakable belief in justice to guide him. He wasn't about to let the system that had wronged his family continue to operate unchecked. As for Claire, she found herself at the center of something she never could have imagined. She became the face of something larger than herself, a symbol of the struggle that so many people faced every day. The video of the incident spread like wildfire, and soon, people across the country were sharing their stories of similar encounters. Social media exploded with outrage, with support for Claire and for the change that needed to happen. For the first time in a long time, Claire felt heard. The world was watching. And this time, they wouldn't look away. The unfolding of justice and the fight for change. The days following the incident at Willow Creek Mall passed in a blur of phone calls, meetings, and relentless media coverage. Marcus could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him. This wasn't just a personal battle for his mother. It was a fight for the larger cause, a fight to hold those who were sworn to protect accountable for their actions. And the fight was far from over. Marcus had spent the past few years working in internal affairs, a division that was as difficult as it was necessary. He had seen the corruption, the complacency, and the quiet complicity that ran rampant within the police force. He had seen good officers silenced by the system, their voices drowned out by the weight of bureaucracy. He had heard countless stories of officers who abused their power, who used their badge to intimidate, to harm, to oppress. But when it came to his mother, when it came to Claire, something within Marcus snapped. This wasn't just another story to file away and forget. This was his family, his mother, and no one, not even his fellow officers, was going to get away with treating her like a criminal because of the color of her skin. As Marcus worked tirelessly to push the case forward, Claire found herself at the center of a whirlwind she hadn't expected. The video of the incident had spread quickly, circulating through social media like wildfire. It wasn't just a video, it was a symbol, a stark reminder of the deep-rooted racism that still existed in places of power, the prejudice that had gone unchecked for far too long. Claire's face, her tear-streaked expression, had become the face of injustice for many who had experienced similar mistreatment. People from all over the country reached out to her, offering words of support, sharing their own stories of racial profiling, and applauding her son for his courage. Claire had never asked for any of this. She had never wanted to be a symbol. She had never wanted to be the center of attention. All she wanted was to live her life, to enjoy the simple pleasures of being a grandmother, to bask in the love of her family. But now, her life had been thrust into the public eye in a way that was both overwhelming and humbling. As the phone calls piled up, Claire found herself speaking with journalists, civil rights activists, and even lawmakers who wanted to hear her story. Her pain, her resilience, and the injustice she had faced resonated with so many. They wanted to know what had happened, why it had happened, and what could be done to make sure it never happened again. For the first time in her life, Claire realized that her voice had the power to reach beyond the walls of her home, to make an impact far greater than she had ever imagined. But as the media storm intensified, so did the resistance. There were those who tried to dismiss the incident, those who claimed that the officers were simply doing their jobs, following procedure. There were people who tried to turn the focus away from the officers' abuse of power and onto Claire, questioning her actions, casting doubt on her character. The familiar tactics of deflection and blame shifting had begun, and Marcus could feel the pressure mounting as he fought to keep the truth at the forefront. In his position with internal affairs, Marcus was well aware of how these things often went. The system had a way of protecting its own. Officers were rarely held accountable for their actions, and even when they were, the consequences were often minimal. But Marcus was determined to change that. He wasn't going to let his mother's pain become another forgotten story. He wasn't going to let these officers walk away unscathed. He couldn't. The tension between Marcus and his colleagues in the department began to grow. While many of his fellow officers supported him, there were others who looked at him with disdain. They didn't understand why he was taking such a hard stance. They didn't understand why he couldn't just let it go. After all, Matthews and Davis were just doing their jobs, weren't they? They hadn't meant to hurt anyone. But Marcus knew better. He knew that what happened to his mother wasn't just a simple mistake. It was a reflection of a much deeper issue, a system that was broken, a system that had been failing people like Claire for far too long. As Marcus sat in his office late one evening, going over the reports and evidence, a familiar knock echoed on his door. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. It was Officer Daniels, one of his trusted colleagues. Daniels had been with him since his early days in the department, and while they had occasionally clashed over issues of justice and accountability, Marcus knew that Daniels was someone who believed in doing the right thing. "You okay?" Daniels asked, his voice soft but concerned as he stepped into Marcus's office. Marcus looked up, his expression weary but resolute. "I'm fine. Just trying to figure out how to make sure this goes through. I don't want them to sweep it under the rug, Daniels. Not this time." Daniels nodded, his face serious. "You know how it works. You've seen it before. They'll try to bury it. They'll say it was a misunderstanding, that they didn't mean it, but you can't let them get away with it." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his fingers brushing against the surface of his desk as he considered Daniels's words. He knew the truth. He knew that his fight wasn't just about this incident. It was about dismantling a system that had allowed incidents like this to happen again and again. He had to do this, not just for his mother, but for every person who had ever been mistreated, for every person who had ever been silenced. "I'm not going to let them get away with it," Marcus said quietly. "Not this time. If I have to, I'll go public. I'll expose everything." Daniels didn't speak for a moment, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. He knew what Marcus was getting at. He knew that once Marcus pushed the issue to the public eye, it wouldn't just be a case of two officers losing their jobs. It would be a full-blown reckoning, something that the department wasn't prepared for. But Daniels also knew that Marcus wouldn't back down. "Not now." "I'll back you up," Daniels said finally, his voice steady. "We need to do this. For Claire. For all of us." With that, Marcus felt a small flicker of relief. He wasn't alone. As much as he had always known that his fight for justice would be lonely at times, it was moments like this that reminded him that there were still good officers out there, people who believed in doing the right thing, no matter the cost. The next few days were a whirlwind of action. Marcus filed the formal complaints against Matthews and Davis, detailing the abuse of power, the racial profiling, and the disregard for human dignity. He submitted the evidence, phone recordings, witness statements, and the video that had gone viral. He knew that the public would demand answers, that the pressure from the outside world would be immense, but he wasn't afraid. The truth was on his side. As the story spread, the pressure on the department increased. Protesters gathered outside the police headquarters, calling for justice, chanting the names of those who had been wronged by the system. Civil rights organizations rallied behind Claire, pushing for systemic change within the police force. The calls for accountability grew louder, and Marcus could feel the shift. The world was watching, and they weren't going to let this story slip away. But for Marcus, this fight wasn't just about exposing two rogue officers. It was about starting a conversation about the systemic racism that plagued the department, about the ways in which people of color were routinely mistreated by those meant to protect them. It was about sparking change, and he wasn't going to stop until he had seen it through. As he sat at his desk late one night, reviewing the latest developments, his phone rang. It was Claire. Her voice was trembling when she spoke. "They're calling for your resignation, Marcus," she said, her words laced with concern. "They're saying you've gone too far, that you're jeopardizing everything." Marcus took a deep breath, his eyes focused on the paperwork in front of him. The threats didn't faze him. He had seen worse in his career. He had been through battles that had tested his resolve. But this was different. This time, it wasn't just about him. "I won't back down, Mom," he said softly. "I got this. We've got this." The fight for justice had only just begun. The escalating struggle and the fight for accountability. The air around Marcus had thickened in the days following the confrontation at Willow Creek Mall. The ripple effect of that single painful moment had grown into a full-scale wave. The video, shot by an onlooker, had gone viral, garnering millions of views and sparking discussions across the country about police brutality, racial profiling, and the systemic issues that plagued law enforcement. Marcus had always known that the road to justice would be challenging, but now it was clearer than ever. This was bigger than his mother's mistreatment. It was a fight for the integrity of the system he had dedicated his life to, and for the countless others who had been harmed by that same system. The pressure on Marcus continued to mount from all sides. Within the department, whispers grew louder, and the discontent among his colleagues spread. There were those who supported him, of course, but there were also many who were uncomfortable with his public stance. They believed that loyalty to the force, to the institution, came first, that internal matters should be handled behind closed doors. To them, Marcus's decision to confront his fellow officers so publicly was an act of betrayal, and while he expected resistance, the animosity that some of his colleagues expressed was more intense than he had anticipated. It wasn't just his fellow officers who were against him. The media had picked up the story and run with it, publishing articles both supportive and critical of Marcus's actions. On one side, people hailed him as a hero, a man of integrity who had taken a stand against corruption in his own ranks. But on the other side, there were those who called him a troublemaker, a disgrace to the badge. Right-wing commentators painted him as a radical, an officer too focused on dismantling the system rather than upholding it. The public debate was fierce. Marcus was used to criticism, but it stung when it came from the very institution he had worked his entire life to protect. For Claire, the weight of her son's battle was heavy in ways she had never expected. She had become an unwilling symbol of the racial injustice that was so deeply embedded in society, and while part of her took pride in the courage Marcus had shown, she also found herself overwhelmed by the attention. Journalists would show up at her door, hoping to get her side of the story, to interview her, to hear the details of what had happened that day at the mall. She didn't want to be in the spotlight. She just wanted things to return to normal. But normal wasn't an option anymore. Yet, even in the face of the chaos, Claire knew one thing for sure. Her son was doing the right thing. He wasn't just fighting for her dignity, but for the dignity of every person who had ever felt unseen or unheard, especially in a system that had failed them time and time again. One evening, as the news continued to break on the incident, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, scrolling through the latest updates. His phone rang, pulling him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the caller ID. It was Daniels. "Hey, Daniels. What's up?" Marcus answered, his voice strained but steady. "I got the update from Aya," Daniels said quietly. "They're trying to bury it, Marcus. They're moving forward with a non-disciplinary resolution for Matthews and Davis. They're not going to press charges. They're calling it a misunderstanding." Marcus clenched his fist, his jaw tightening. This was exactly what he had feared. The system was trying to protect its own, just like it always did. He had already anticipated the political maneuvering, the pushback, but hearing the words confirmed the harsh reality. This wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be a simple case of right and wrong. "I knew it," Marcus muttered under his breath, his frustration boiling over. "They're trying to sweep this under the rug, just like they always do. They think the public will forget about it," Daniel said. "But you and I both know it's not over. You've got the evidence, Marcus. You've got the witnesses. You can't let them get away with this." Marcus took a deep breath. He had worked too hard to get to this point, too hard to allow it to be buried in a pile of political red tape. He wasn't going to let this go. Not now. Not when so many people were depending on him. "I'll take it public," Marcus said, determination clear in his voice. "I'm not backing down. We'll keep pushing this. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure Matthews and Davis are held accountable." The next few days became a whirlwind of action. Marcus and Daniels began to gather support from various activists, civil rights organizations, and sympathetic officers who believed in the cause. They contacted local news outlets, and soon, the story broke into the public eye again. But this time, it wasn't just about one incident. It was about systemic change. The pressure on the department intensified. Protests erupted outside police headquarters, with people marching for accountability, for transparency, and for justice. The chants of "no justice, no peace" rang through the streets, and Claire, watching from her living room, felt the weight of it all. Her son's fight was no longer just his own. It was for every person who had been mistreated, for every person who had suffered at the hands of a system that was supposed to protect them. For Marcus, the fight was just beginning. He knew that if he went public, if he continued to demand accountability for Matthews and Davis, it would come at a cost. But he couldn't turn back now. The people who had supported him, the people who had been inspired by Claire's story, were counting on him to see it through. And he was determined to honor that trust. The decision to go public came with consequences. The department, under increasing pressure from both internal and external forces, began to distance itself from Marcus. His superiors, who had once praised his dedication, now looked at him with suspicion. They saw him as a threat to the institution, a man who was willing to tear down the walls that had protected them for so long. Some officers, once colleagues he had trusted, now avoided him, casting sidelong glances and speaking in hushed tones behind closed doors. But Marcus didn't care. He had made his decision, and he knew that, ultimately, it was the right one. As Marcus prepared for the next phase of the fight, he found himself reflecting on his own journey. Growing up in a family where his mother had struggled against injustice, where his own community had faced discrimination at every turn, Marcus had always been determined to make a difference. He had joined the police force not to uphold the status quo, but to change it from within. And now, with everything on the line, he realized that he was no longer just an officer of the law. He was a part of something larger, something that would take more than just one man to fix. It would take a movement. It would take courage. It would take the voices of the unheard, the voices of those who had been silenced for too long. But as he sat alone in his office late that night, his phone buzzed once more. It was Claire. "I saw the news," Claire said, her voice trembling but filled with resolve. "Marcus, I'm proud of you. You're doing the right thing. You're standing up for what's right." Marcus's throat tightened. He hadn't realized just how much her words would mean to him until now. In the midst of all the noise, all the pressure, all the tension, hearing his mother's voice, hearing her unwavering support, reminded him why he had started this journey in the first place. "I couldn't do it without you, Mom," Marcus replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You've shown me what real strength is. I'll make sure their voices are heard. I promise." And with that, Marcus knew that he wasn't alone. His fight wasn't just for justice in a single case. It was for the future, for a world where people didn't have to fear those meant to protect them. It was a fight that would echo through generations, a fight that would carry the lessons of the past into the hope of the future. The next few weeks would test Marcus in ways he never imagined. But with his mother's strength guiding him, and the support of a community determined to see change, he knew this was only the beginning. The fight for justice was never easy, but it was always worth it.